I'm going to have you in Psalm 139. So if you have a Bible with you, open to Psalm 139. We're going to spend some time in the Psalm of David. And the reason I picked this psalm was two experiences this past week caused me to think about this psalm. One was the Kobe Bryant story that I'm sure all of you heard about last Sunday when tragically he and his daughter and 7 other passengers were killed on that helicopter in Southern California. Horrible, sad. I mean, the news has been a buzz all week, of course, in light of that, in the wake of what happened. And so I found myself thinking about that. And Kobe Bryant was 41 years old, 2 years younger than me. His daughter, who passed away, was 13 years old, about a year older than Juliana, my oldest daughter. Just forced me to wrestle with the frailty of life, and it forced me to wrestle with how we don't know how long we have. We all have an expiration date. We don't know when it is. Difficult one. So I was grappling with that and reading articles and listening to some discussion on that topic. And that drew my attention to Psalm 139. And then the other thing that happened was, I think it was Tuesday night, I went to the school, Tumwater High School. In our school district, about every quarter, there's a counselor, kind of a adolescent psychology expert in the area who will give talks on different topics. And I've never been before, but I noticed that her topic was going to be the topic of anxiety. And so I said, well, I'll just go to this one because I know it's a big issue today, and especially amongst young people. And so I went and listened to her talk for an hour and a half on that topic. And the interesting link between the Kobe Bryant story and that experience was, as I'm sitting there listening to everything she's saying about anxiety and all the various forms of anxiety and how it's on the rise in our culture, and how they say now in the teenage years or middle school, high school years, 1 in 3 teenagers have some form of chronic anxiety, some form of, whether it's debilitating or at least problematic, ongoing anxiety. So I'm listening to everything she's saying, and the thought occurred to me, man, if we didn't struggle with mortality, if we weren't preoccupied with preserving our lives, protecting our interests, if we weren't preoccupied with promoting ourselves, we probably wouldn't have any anxiety. There's a link between anxiety and mortality, the fear of death, because every fear is somehow related to a loss. And every loss of life kind of points forward to death. And so I'm thinking about these different things, all related to mortality and anxiety, and my mind went to Psalm 139. And so I want to share some things with you that have been encouraging for me, and I hope will be encouraging for you as well, knowing that every one of you deals with some type of anxiety in your life, some form of anxiety. And your kids do, if you have kids. Your grandkids do, if you have grandkids. It's a deep, common human struggle. Whether it's debilitating or not, it is a common human struggle. And this psalm invites us to find help in relationship with God. So, Psalm 139, we will walk through it, and I want to kind of work backwards. So, first of all, look at the end of it. Look how King David ends the psalm. He says in verse 23 and 24, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way." So the end of it is him crying out to God, saying, God, search me. One translation is examine me. My translation is, God, make sense of what's going on in my mind. So that's where the psalm ends. Well, working backwards, I want to look at how he develops in this psalm his thinking regarding the character of God, regarding the nature of God, and how this reveals to us in a way why David is putting his trust in God, why he's looking to God. It has to do with his understanding of who God is, and so we're going to talk about that. Now think about David for a minute. King David, probably aside from Jesus, probably the most well-known Jewish man in human history. Iconic Jewish hero who had experienced some significant challenges in his life, right? I mean, he was kind of a superstar in a way, but he had risen from obscurity. He was the runt of his family, and then he gets this privileged position as king of Israel. And he was no stranger to opposition. David's life, we could say, is a story of being hated and being hunted by other people. He had lots of enemies, beginning with King Saul, who was jealous of him, who wanted him dead. Leaders of surrounding nations who wanted him dead. His own family was riddled with conflict. His son Absalom formed a mutiny against him. I mean, he was not a stranger to hostility, to warfare with people, whether it was actual physical warfare or the psychological or mental part of it. I mean, it was familiar to him. And he was no stranger to anxiety. He knew what fear felt like. He had a lot of it in his life. He had a lot of it. And so this is him dealing with his own anxiety, dealing with his own fear, dealing with those thoughts that were going through his mind. Those negative, hopeless thoughts that we all have in our lives. So verses 1 through 6, notice how he highlights God's knowledge of him, how God knows him. He says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down and are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You have enclosed me behind and before and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it." He says, God, you know me. You know my mind. You know my thoughts. You understand my thoughts better than I understand my thoughts, is basically what he's saying. You examine me. You scrutinize my path. You are intimately acquainted with all of my ways. This reminds us that we are not alone in our own minds. That's a good thing, isn't it? Rose, you just said, that's good. That is really good. We are not alone in our own minds. God knows everything we think. He says, before I speak a word, you know it. You know, God, what I think. And our minds are thinking, I mean, it's incalculable, the number of thoughts that go through our minds. It's thousands, tens of thousands of thoughts every day going through our minds constantly. And God is aware of all of them. And in one sense, it's a little bit scary to consider that God is aware of everything. In fact, you think of it this way, you know, there's this ongoing discussion that's becoming more and more relevant because of technology, but the relationship between security and freedom, and we want our freedom, but in order to have freedom, we need security, but in order to have security, that kind of is a risk in terms of losing freedom. But then if we highlight the freedom side, then we risk losing our security, and so there's this kind of wrestling match philosophically that goes on. How far do we need to go with all the cameras? We've got like the Ring doorbell cams now, and they're everywhere, right? Everybody's being watched all the time. And so you think of Big Brother and you think of intrusive government and how that's a scary thing. It should be scary because human beings are scary. But the irony is when it comes to God's knowledge of even our thought life, that is the safest place, is to be known by God. That's true security, ironically, isn't it? It's true freedom to be known by God, because that means I'm not stuck with my own thoughts for me to rescue myself from them, because a lot of my thoughts, just like a lot of your thoughts, are not healthy. My thoughts are deceptive. My thoughts are filled at times with anxiety and fear and anger and greed. And what David is acknowledging here is that God knows his innermost thoughts, and God knows yours, and God knows mine, and he is marveling over that, and he is finding some peace there. He is experiencing comfort in light of that. And when we think of who our God is and how he's revealed his heart, especially how he's revealed himself through the person and work of Jesus, which we will unpack a little bit later in the message. But when we think about how God's heart and his love for us is revealed, I mean, there's no safer place than being known by God. So David he's understanding that truth and celebrating that truth. And that's why he says in verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too high, I cannot attain it. I mean, on one level, he's just amazed at the ability God has. It wasn't long ago, my daughter Jocelyn said to me, she's thinking through some theology at her age, at age 8. And she said, so Dad, God, he can hear everybody at the same time? I said, yeah, he can hear everybody at the same time. I mean, you know what it's like to be in a crowded place and you hear all the different voices and talk, like in a restaurant or something like that, and you can't even distinguish one conversation from others. It's just like white noise. And so I think she was kind of realizing that and how amazing that is, and said, wow, God can hear everybody at the same time. And I said, hey, Joss, not only that, he knows what everybody's thinking at the same, all the time, everybody. There's 7 billion people plus in the world right now, and God is aware of every single thought of every single person. That's wonderful. It's awe-inspiring is what David is getting at in verse 6. It's truly amazing. It's amazing to think that he knows our thoughts and that we are safe in God's knowledge of us. And the greatest safety for us is in the illumination or the enlightenment, as we talked about in Sunday school this morning, as God opens our eyes in the area of our thinking to see things as he sees things. And so David is, we could say, apprehending that in this psalm here. He's approaching that type of understanding and saying, God, it all begins with this knowledge that you know my thoughts. You know every one of them. And then he goes on from there to describe and to celebrate God's presence with him. Verse 7, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you, God. So this is describing God's, the big theological word, omnipresence. God is everywhere present all the time. And David says, there's nowhere I can go where you are not. He's with us everywhere. He's with us in bed while we're asleep. He's with us on the freeway while we're awake, hopefully. He's with us in a plane in the sky. He's with us if we were to be under the sea, scuba diving to the depths of the sea. He's there. He's with us if Elon Musk takes us to space on his SpaceX rocket someday. If we can purchase a ticket and just fly into space on one of those things, he'll be with us there. He's with us everywhere, all the time. And that brought comfort to David to think of God encompassing him in that way. God surrounding him. God knowing him and God being with him. As we say a lot around here, sometimes we can kind of sense that, or we have maybe kind of warranted or perhaps unwarranted warm, fuzzy feelings when we think of God or when we sing of God, and we may feel his presence. You hear people say that, and that's a valid human experience. But whether we feel it or not, this is what, through inspiration, David is saying is true. This is what's true. The Creator is with us everywhere, all the time. It's true. And then he goes into God's plan for him and zooms in a bit more to him as an individual, the uniqueness of who God made David to be, which helps us think about the uniqueness of who he made us to be. Verse 13, for you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. I said earlier, one of the hardest things to grapple with as a mortal human being is the fact that we all have an expiration date. We know our lives are going to come to an end at some point. We don't know how many days we have in this world. But this says God has already ordained the number of our days. He has that determined. He formed us in our mother's womb. We had nothing to do with that. We weren't there, weren't in control. We weren't making choices. That was God's decision. He created you. He gave you your DNA, your genetic makeup. You had no say in that. God made you who you are. He put you in the family that you grew up in. All of that was determined by God. So from the beginning to the end, he's saying God is over it all. This is one of the things that came up over and over in Exodus, is we talked about, hey, we're these humans, and this is why we sang the song that we just finished singing at the end. About let my words be few. You are God in heaven, and here am I on earth. That there are like these two planes to think about. There's the plane of my life where I'm going forward and proceeding, and some things I see clearly and some things I don't. I certainly don't know the future, and neither do you, and we're stumbling along and trying to make sense of things, and we're struggling with all sorts of internal battles along the way, right? And then there's God up in heaven who sees it all and who has a plan for it all, who's the author, capital A, of human history, who's the author of your life and my life. David is here considering God's sovereignty in that sense, that God is over it all and that he determines, it says in Isaiah 46:10, God has determined the end from the beginning. And that is pertinent for your life and for my life. He has all that taken care of. The other night, Jocelyn came in. The girls had already been in bed for a little while, but she came knocking on our door. She was awake and came in crying and said, hey, what's going on? And it was the same night that I went and sat through that talk on anxiety at the school. And so all that's fresh on my mind. And she comes in and she's crying. She says, I just remember when, and it was like a year and a half ago, we were up at Lake Cushman swimming. And she was out there in a deep part of the lake and lost her flotation device. I forget what she had, but something handheld. And she had lost it and she started to go under. And one of the other kids, it might have been Reese or somebody, had to grab her out. And that was the second time that's happened to her. That actually happened to her once before, many years ago. She was 4 or 5 maybe, at a relative's pool where we're like, where's Jocelyn? We looked and she's dunked and she's a foot under the water just going like this. And at that point in time, even scarier because she couldn't swim at all and I had to go scoop her out. I'll never forget it. And her mind, she was going back to those places, which we think of anxiety, we think of like forward, things we're afraid of happening in the future, but it's also related to contemplating almost like a PTSD type thing, like thinking about a trauma, something that happened and then fearing what could happen, right? And so she came in and she was just really upset about it. And so we had a little conversation about that. And we talked about not only how our minds tend to go to those places, but hey, Jocelyn, like you're here right now and we're at home. You're not in the water even, right? It's all okay. Go back to bed. We want to go to sleep now. Just kidding. We had a good father-daughter moment, and we talked about, hey, it's good for us to be aware. It's good for us to be cautious. And God is in control, and God's determined the number of your days and the number of my days, and we can be so thankful that's true. In one sense, our instinct, our self-preserving instinct is really important, and we need that. That's what keeps us out of trouble, keeps us from foolish, crazy, sometimes thrill-seeking activities, is realizing we're fragile, right? That's a good thing, but when it becomes like on hyperdrive and it's this obsession and it just becomes enslaving and controlling, and God invites us to remember that He's the one in charge ultimately. Yeah, we got to be aware. We have to be cautious, but we also have to live our lives. And if we're going to think of every possible accident that could happen, or what, you'd never go anywhere. You'd live in a padded room. Like what? There's so many dangers in this world, this fallen, cursed world. I mean, we could number them. We could spend hours numbering them and never even scrape the surface of all the things that could go wrong to our bodies, in our surroundings, traveling back and forth, natural disasters, the mega quake or whatever could happen here, or the Mount Rainier erupting, if that were to ever happen. I mean, if, hey, a meteorite could fly out of the solar system, and I mean, you can't, I mean, you could go crazy trying to manage everything and make everything be safe and everything be secure. It truly could drive us to insanity. David is here reflecting on God's sovereignty, God's plan. Storyline's already been determined. So in the uniqueness of who David was, the uniqueness of who we are, the gifts and abilities, wonderful are your works. Hey, it is a great thing that we get to live, and God's given us each gifts and abilities, and we live in this temporal, limited life. And over it all is God. And so he continues, verse 17, how precious are your thoughts to me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. We said in Sunday school that so often our minds are preoccupied with things other than God. And we have, of course, we have a life to live and decisions to make and work to do and children to take care of or other errands to run, whatever it is. We have busy lives, and our minds are processing things so we can navigate our busy lives, and we have thoughts of God. We do. I think everyone in here, you have thoughts of God. Hopefully you're able to spend some time reading or praying throughout the week. You have thoughts of God, but you have a limited number of thoughts of God, and David's saying here, God, your thoughts toward me are unlimited. And he gives this really vivid illustration. He says, if I were to try to count them, it would outnumber the sand. So just picture your hand, right? If you cup your hand, if we just pour some sand in there, not even that much when you compare how much sand is like on the seashore at the beach, but just a little bit. Imagine trying to count the grains of sand. One by one. Could make you go crazy just thinking about it. He's saying, but God, your thoughts toward me are countless. Oftentimes, God seems so distant because of what we find ourselves thinking about or what we even feel. But this says God is not distant. He is close. He is scrutinizing you in a good way. Think of that with a good connotation. He knows you. And with all his thoughts, as he thinks about you, he knows what plagues you. He knows the struggles you have. He knows, to keep on point here, he knows the anxiety you have. He knows what you are fearful of. He knows your distressing thoughts or the thoughts that make you feel fearful, pressure, stress. I mean, he knows all of it. He understands it better than you do. And he cares, and he has mercy on you, and he has mercy on me. And the interpretation of our thoughts is safer in terms of God's interpretation of our thoughts than even our interpretation of our thoughts, if that makes sense. How he understands us, that he knows the truth which sets free, and he's committed to imparting that to us. And we'll come around to in the end how through Christ he does that. Let's go a little farther. Verse 19, this is an interesting section, almost seems like a parenthetical and a little bit oddly placed, but David says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed, for they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. So this is one of those challenging, they call them imprecatory psalms, where David is bringing his enemies before God, who he refers to as God's enemies as well, and he's dealing with this realm. Remember I said earlier, he experienced a lot of conflict in his life. One of the most difficult trials for David was the conflict with people in his family, other leaders from surrounding nations, coups that developed within his own nation, all sorts of things going on that he just dealt with people, and he viewed those people as a threat to him personally. He viewed them as a threat to God's kingdom in a way, and he's saying, God, deal with them. I think this is his way of saying not only like this self-preserving thing, but there's probably also an element here of just, God, put an end to the hostility of this world. David was grappling with that difficult part of life, human hate, human violence, and he says, hey, this has a spiritual rebellious root to it. God, deal with it. And then we have in the New Testament, Jesus says, love your enemies, right? So what in the world? How do you make sense of this? Well, on one human level, he's just expressing what is within him because of the specific types of trials that he's enduring. And it's not necessarily prescriptive, not necessarily saying, so therefore pray this way, as it's just the outcry of a normal human heart. And then you get to the New Testament where Jesus makes clear the heart and disposition of God, and it's good for us to consider what that is. And I've read, someone shared this quote, I don't even know who the author was. The author was listed, but it's not a name I know. But the quote is on Facebook the other day. You can safely assume that you've created a God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. So this is not prescribing some kind of hatred that would contradict the words of Jesus. This is the natural response or outcry of a human heart in the midst of a pressure cooker of conflict. And it's not unfamiliar, is it? In terms of how we can think and how we think about the people. So different forms of anxiety, a lot of them relate to relationships, right? Social anxiety disorder, you hear about that one. Performance anxiety disorder, relational implications there. David is saying, if you would just put an end to all this, then I could be okay. But knowing that and perhaps exercising a little bit of healthy self-doubt, from there he goes back to his internal problems. So from that external kind of wrestling back to internal. So the last two verses, which we started with, we'll end with, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there be any hurtful or any painful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. He comes back around to, God, I need you to search me and to know me. God, I need your knowledge of me. My knowledge of me is getting me into trouble. My knowledge of my circumstances is getting me into trouble. I have no peace. I have no rest. I'm anxious. That word is like, one translation, disquieted. It's like this just constant noise inside of me. There's no rest. There's another psalm where the psalmist says, when my anxious thoughts multiply within me, just multiplying more and more and more, and just feels so enslaving. And then it goes on to say, your consolations delight my soul, oh God. Like, God, you are the only hope for that part of my experience. He says, God, you're my hope. Just find my mind flooded with anxious thoughts. You're my hope, God. And that's some of what David is experiencing here. He is looking to the God who looks to him. And he's saying, search me, know me, try me, know my anxious thoughts, like expose them, show me, and see if there be any hurtful or any way that would cause pain, and lead me in the everlasting way. And this, to me, I had this moment just this morning preparing for the message, this kind of epiphany, the everlasting way. Everything is pointing, as every study we do here in church, everything is pointing to Jesus. He's who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He embodies the everlasting way. And so how do we make sense of this? Well, think of the life of Jesus. And I'm going to set it up this way. There's a sports analyst named Skip Bayless. Some of you have listened to him maybe on sports radio or there's a TV show on, I think it's on ESPN. And I have a podcast I listen to, and he's on there. And so he was talking about what happened with Kobe Bryant last Sunday. And his initial response when he learned that the news was in fact true, that Kobe Bryant was dead, when he learned that, the first thing he said was, no way, not Kobe Bryant. He was too big to die. He was too great to die. And I want to think, for one thing, that there's a guy that's just at the pinnacle, right? He had retired as a basketball player, but in some ways he was at the sort of the high point of his life. In his prime, he was writing children's books. He was involved with coaching his daughters, doing all sorts of productive things, even charitable things. Kind of a neat story if you look into it, in terms of how he changed and was humbled by life. Kind of a neat story there. And you think, what in the world? If of all people, you could say a superstar, a guy with that kind of resources, that kind of power. And if he can go, and all of us kind of aspire to greatness, but don't even come close to where he's at. But if he can go, any of us can go. And as I said earlier, there's something there. The reason that is stunning is it does touch on that human wrestling match with mortality, wherein I want to be great, I want to be big, I want to be too great, too big to die. Don't you? Part of me, naturally speaking, I want to be. And I would love it if God would sort of join my plan and how that might come to fruition in this world. God, just participate. I got some great ideas here. I would love that. But you are God in heaven, and here am I on earth, and you're big and I'm small. And so now how does this come to this sort of explosive clarity, crystallization in Jesus? Here is Jesus, God the Son, coming into the world in flesh. If anyone in this world could be great, could be big, it was him. If anyone in this world could prevent death, his own death, it was him. And yet he lives, the immortal God lives as a mortal man, and he becomes small, and he becomes the least, not the biggest, not the greatest, but becomes small and becomes the least. And then he goes to a premature, we could say, what people say, Kobe Bryant is a premature death. He was only 41. Jesus died at around 33. It says a premature death. What in the world are you doing? Why would you go out that way? Why would you let yourself be humiliated in that way? He's teaching us what it really means to be human. Jesus lived free. He wasn't plagued by the same unhealthy obsession with self-preservation, self-protection, and self-promotion. He accepted the plan of his Father for his life. He accepted it. He embraced it. He did what you and I can't, naturally speaking, do. He was small. He was the least. And he died in our place. And that's not the end of the story, is it? Because then he rose. And he says, come, he who lives and believes in me will never die. And in one sense, like he's inviting us. I almost entitled the message, Facing Death and Learning to Live. Like in one sense, he invites us just to face it. Just face your mortality. Just accept it. That's the best thing for you. So he says, come, take up your cross and die with me. And we can interpret that in different ways, but on one level it says, look, life is going to be filled with losses. It's inescapable. And the real root of anxiety is the struggle to overcome and make those losses not happen. Whether they're relational losses or material losses or status losses or whatever. How can I prevent those things? And so we feverishly scramble to try to keep that from happening. And then in His way, in His time, God has a way of kind of making us face them. And we have the voice of Jesus saying, come and die with me and learn to live. Learn to live. If I could somehow shut off my self-protective mechanism, which for me is often on hyperdrive, if I could shut it off, I could conceive of like the peace that I would have. Well, God's not telling me to shut it off. He's not telling you to just shut it off or just to make. He's not telling you that. Nor is He telling you, hey, and this is the way I used to think was kind of like, well, if we believe in God and we follow God's ways, and we touched on this in Sunday school as well. So many recurring themes here, but we touched on this. But if I just follow God and His ways, then He'll protect me, and He'll keep those bad things from happening to me. And that's a very attractive idea. But the inconvenient truth is He lets bad stuff happen to His people all the time. Basically, every biblical character we see and every other human being, losses are inevitable. And sometimes they're excruciating. So it can't be that one, He just says, well, you fix it. And it can't be in the other, He just says, well, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to take away all the circumstances. So what is it? He invites us to look up, as David did, to reflect on his character, who he is, what he's like. And if it was His heart that led Him to send Jesus into this world, to live in our place and die in our place, and to do what we can't do, to embrace obscurity, to embrace the fringes, to be small, to be the least, if He did that for you, to cover you, to provide for you, to go to the cross for you, to take the curse for you, to rise for you, to assure you of eternal life, if He did that for you, then every time we stumble and bump into our anxiety, there is an opportunity to just rehearse and to revisit the truth of who He is. That He is trustworthy. That His capital T truth is what makes sense of your life. And it's where peace is rediscovered and joy is rediscovered and freedom is experienced. So it's not about managing and fixing. It's a relationship. And God is just saying, just remember who I am. Remember what I've done for you. And I believe that as God opens our eyes to the truth of who He is and what He's done for us, that we do experience measures of peace. Sometimes it's up and down. Sometimes it's a season, and then something might change circumstantially. But there is real, genuine peace granted to us. I hope you can sense that. I hope you are encouraged by that. I hope that helps you and that connects the realities of God and His revelation of Himself with you and your life. And so now we're going to do one more thing here with our communion, and that's just our reflecting on the truth, our taking in as we pass out the little piece of bread and the cup. This represents the body, the tangible body and blood of Jesus given for us, His blood shed for us to assure us of forgiveness, to assure us of this place of safety in relation with our God. So let's do that. I'm going to have Greg and other volunteers come forward, and Dave and Mikkel. You guys they're going to ask Dave if they would sing that same song, Hideaway, which is a beautiful song. So they'll sing that, and you can, if you want to sing along, you can, or you can just listen and be refreshed as you think about how you are hidden away in the love of Christ. Okay? Let's pray, and then we'll have that song. God, thank you for this message from Psalm 139. Thank you for what you've Open our eyes to see in these moments today. Thank you for the gift of life, God. Help us to accept our mortality and to marvel over eternal life through Christ. In his name we pray. Amen.